All right, so welcome everyone to a new session of the Archaeological Research Seminar. Today we have the great pleasure to introduce Søren Sindbæk from the University of Aarhus, who has come all the way today to make this presentation about the workshops in Ribe that I'm looking forward to hear more about. I hope you are too. And also for those that if you are not aware of, we are also live streaming, so you have to know that too, okay? So here you have the microphone.
Thank you very much.
And the stage.
Ja. Lad os se på det måde. Så. Ja, god eftermiddag alle her. Jeg var ikke helt sikker på, om jeg skulle tale engelsk eller dansk, men jeg ved, at Rebecca forstår i hvert fald bedst engelsk, så jeg tænker, at vi holder os til det. Og vi ved jo heller ikke, hvad folk ude i den anden ende af livestreamen, de taler. Så hvis det er i orden med jer, så holder jeg foredrag på engelsk. Jeg har fået at vide, at mikrofonerne her ikke er sat til, så hvis jeg taler for lavt, så råb op bag i salen, og tilsvarende på livestreamen. In the livestream, if the microphone doesn't work, please send a message and we will sort it out. So, I'm here today for practical reasons because I was invited, I think, a year ago or so to become a co-supervisor for Rebecca's project, which is about Viking Age art styles and craft technology. So I thought that coming here today, I would talk about those subjects. And the point of departure for me is a very special discovery and excavation that we undertook a few years ago and have been working on in the Viking Age and pre-Viking Age town of Ribe in Denmark. So I will start by introducing a little bit where we started out. This is what Ribe looks like from above, and as you can see, it's a very nice, recognizably medieval town centered around its cathedral, and from the archaeological point of perspective, of course, the most interesting thing is that the middle of that medieval town sits on top of 4 to 6 meters of stratigraphy, which holds an enormous lot of information about the Middle Ages. But since the 1950s, when excavations first began, partly I think inspired by the 1955 start of excavations here in Bergen, there has been a search not just for medieval Ribe, but for its Viking Age predecessor. The Vikings are always the missing X that we are searching for in Scandinavian towns. And for a number of years that search was unsuccessful because people were quite naturally searching in the area of the medieval town. But by chance in 1972 it was discovered that the Viking Age activity in Ribe had been centered over on this side of the river. And that became the start of a research adventure, and it also turned out to be in the long run a great help for exploration, because it meant that the Viking Age levels here were not covered by 4 to 6 meters of medieval stuff that had to be also investigated every time we had to go down. So since 1972 there has occasionally been excavations on this side of the river, and perhaps you are familiar with images such as this reconstruction that for a long time has been a model of how not just Ribe started, but how trading places in Scandinavia started out as seasonal market sites. But in actual fact, the excavations in Ribe uncovered on a very unusual archive, and you can see this image, at least part of the reason why. The place that was excavated was not just a site with an exceptional function in its own days. It was, cutting a long story short, it was the earliest place that we today can identify as something that seemed to operate like a town or an urban place with a primary focus on crafts and trade. It also had preserved an incredible amount of materials and finds associated with that, with activities in that place. And as you can see here, at least in part, those remains were surprisingly undisturbed. A stratigraphy like this is very rare. In most cases, you would find the layers to be a lot more mixed by more recent material activities. But in Ribe, you can look at sections like this and think that you could almost turn the layers like leaves in a book and read decade by decade what was going on. However, when we asked even simple questions about this unusual place, we ran into trouble, at least until a few years ago. Ask any of those questions: how did the place start? What was it like? Who lived there? What happened? When did it end? And that would have started a major argument if there was more than one archaeologist in the room. And the main reason for that was that the excavations that had taken place the early excavations had been of a certain size, but had mainly been placed sort of in gardens and outside areas that turned out not to be really the central parts of the early site. And later on in the 1980s and 90s, there were indeed excavations, some of them very excellently conducted, but they were limited to very small, narrow trenches where reconstruction work took place. So for that reason, a lot of the context remained perplexing. In 2016, together with the Museum of Southwest Jutland, I managed to persuade the Carlsberg Foundation that this situation was a tragedy for one of Denmark's most interesting archaeological sites, and that we could do better. And we managed to get funding to do a large-scale or relatively large-scale excavation at a site of our own choice. And by that time, the various investigations had given us an understanding of the early plan that was sound enough that we could choose an area that would cover the actual middle street area in the center of this location, together with a complete, or in some periods near complete, house plots and part of its neighboring plots in a place where that stratigraphy was preserved for about 200 years. And for that reason, I can only say, as Carlsberg always says, if you're an archaeologist, this is probably the best beer in the world. So do support us. So we started out in May 2017, and this is what it looked like when we had removed the paving. And what we did was not just dig down, but we wanted to dig down in a more expert way than the earlier excavations had taken place, had done. So we set ourselves a target of doing what we called high-definition archaeology, which involved at least 3 specific targets. We wanted to use the geological technique of micromorphology, where you take thin slices of the stratigraphy and can study them in microscope level throughout the excavation. And that turned out to be extremely useful for telling us whether a particular deposit was something taking place within a building or outside a building, or whether, let's say, an ash layer had been deposited in an area where a fire took place, or whether it had been moved there subsequently, and so on. Whether a boundary between two layers represented a change in the build-up, or the fact that somebody had cut away, truncated part of the deposits. So we got a much more firm understanding of what was going on layer by layer in this way. We also, to try and keep track of how all those tiny layers related to the bigger picture, we had a 3D laser scanner as our primary recording, field recording method, which meant that we didn't just get back with outlined plans of layers, but could reconstruct in 3 dimensions site plans for every layer that we removed. It turned out to be extremely useful, especially when we, as always happens, sometimes discovered we might have done things wrong, misunderstood things in the situation. One example being this little tiny amber axe, which was found in 3 different parts, in 3 different layers, annoyingly relating to 3 different phases when in our matrix. But we were actually able to work out what had happened and how one piece almost certainly had been a wrongly separated layer and another in displacement. And so one of those questions that could forever have been such an open question, oh, this is one of our top 10 objects and we don't know where it came from, actually could be tweaked into something where we have a pretty good idea what was going on between those layers. And finally, we did 100% water sealing, which luckily is becoming a standard, at least in some excavations, and also lucky for the archaeology students who got to experience this, because digging in Ribe can be quite extreme in terms of finds, and a good experience, as you can tell by their faces. But it also meant that we, for every major context, we don't have just a few finds that hint at something going on. We can really see with statistical probability what is going on. What is a major craft, what is something that might be residual remains that have been transported by accident, and so on. So forth. And in this way we were able to reconstruct a sequence of at least 20 house floors that had succeeded each other in the main area. This is one of the earliest ones. At this stage, early stage, we have wet preservation in part of the site, and you can see the difference from the back side where we have dry preservation. If we had excavated only this part, we might never have guessed that we were digging in a building, but understanding the this part with wall remains and post remains, we can understand also why houses were not recognized in early excavations there. And we get an extremely full picture of stuff going on in this building. We can date it by date chronology to a period of just 7 or 8 years after 723 when it was built. And we can see a very, very unusual combination of, where we really get a thick description, if you will, of what's going on in a house, both craft activities, this is a glass bead working area over here, and social activities like there's 3 or 4 combs and lots of household objects, including this. I think in Norwegian that would be a kleinespor as well, or is there another word? It is what you use for pastries. Never found one before, but it's clearly what it is. A very sharp edge to cut flatbread or cake. And oops, a musical instrument, the earliest lyre in Scandinavia. So quite a rich context, and that's just 8 years. We can move up 10 years, and suddenly we're in a shoemakers and comb makers house. Moved 10 years more. Now the bead maker has moved in, a very tasteless one, as you can see, and so on and so forth. Later in the 8th century, we start to get a very interesting mixture of fauna that's not usually found in Denmark, like reindeer antler and pine marten. And who would have guessed, and where would such things come from? Well, our guess is that they come from Western Norway and show developing contacts with the central Scandinavia. I could keep on for a long time about this, how well, we keep getting a succession of activities through the 9th century, but I have a limited time, so I will only talk about one of the 9th century phases. If you want the whole story, I'm actually very proud that we released the first of the 2 volumes of the final publications already this summer. The second is due in January or February next year. I'm sitting right now, when I'm not speaking, with the final proofs of it. So we'll be able to present the findings to our wider network of colleagues very soon. We also had a target in this excavation to try and use the opportunity to work on our method development, and a number of papers have come out on that, including studies on geochemistry in the soil layers, excavation method, and we're currently running through all those crafts and trying to understand them also from the point of view of technical analysis. And there's a very interesting, I think so, paper that recently came out about the glass bead technology that showed us a level of sophistication which we actually hadn't expected. One particular development that I'm very proud of and have to flag up is what we did with our dating of our absolute dates of the layers. Very often we'll find that when we try to use radiocarbon to in a context where historical dates matter, that the uncertainties of the methods makes the results practically useless. This is an actual typical calibration of what would be a single radiocarbon date. And if you ask, for instance, does something happen before or after a particular event, you're not any wiser either after that. But in our project, we had a close collaboration with the Radiocarbon Dating Center in Aarhus, and our colleague there had made us aware that something funny had happened a few years before. This Japanese researcher, Fuji Miyake, and her team had discovered that radiocarbon does not behave the way that physicists have always thought. They thought that since we're measuring something that is circulating in the atmosphere of the whole planet, that the levels would change only very slightly. But when Fuji Miyake and her team tested a weird exception in the radiocarbon calibration curves and took samples for every year of tree rings, they discovered that on a few occasions radiocarbon levels have jumped quite significantly in a measurable degree, probably because of large solar storms. And one of those took place in 775, and we sat down calculating and realized that if you had a normal context, it probably wouldn't matter a lot to your dating, but if for some reason you were working in a site with a very fine stratigraphy, you would be able to find layers where the samples would calibrate down here, followed by others where they will calibrate up here. So we had we realized there was a chance in our particular site to get a 1-year precision date for at least this layer. And we worked on that, and we had to work out our own calibration curve from scratch based on timbers, because there wasn't an annual calibration curve like that. And the results actually brought our excavation to an unlikely outlet for humanistic research, the journal Nature, earlier this year, because we succeeded in using this to pinpoint when in our stratigraphy we passed the year 775. As you can see, this is some of the results we can do when we have this fine stratigraphic work. Here are bar charts of various types of finds: Norwegian imports, Rhine area imports, imported beads from the Middle East, craft-related finds of certain types. So you can see quite a lot of changes taking place. So it's very important for us to get a date on that. And for the late 8th century, the Miyake event, as it was called, became our hook. And we can say, for that reason, something which I think is quite interesting now, that we know that the first Eastern beads that comes from Russia and the Caliphate area, they turn up in a layer here which is 2 or 3 events after 775. On the other hand, we have got Norwegian bulk items like hones or soapstone and reindeer antler coming up more than 20 years before that. So we could use those results to give a new timeline and sequence for some of the events that leads to the maritime interactions, or mark out the expanding maritime interactions that we call the Viking Age. In this way, we are actually now able to follow sort of the changes in a very unusual community, not on the usual archaeological level of half or whole centuries, but decade by decade. And we can say, for instance, that the buildings here were not inhabited by people who came and went. It's not as if every building had 5 or 10 different tenants that came with different crafts. The buildings are raised. There will typically be one major craft that's practiced in them. They will stand for something between 8 and 15, 20 years in some cases. They'll be leveled, a new building comes up, a new craft comes in. That means to me that we're dealing with a quite stable community of at least some residents who are there on a long-term basis. And that all starts not really with a long period of seasonal use, but with a very strong and clearly marked building, which is actually the first thing we see on this side. So the early stages of this trading place and of trade in Iron Age Scandinavia can be revised from these results. But the focus that I promised to take today was on something that happens around 800. Ribe is famous for objects like these, which are clay molds for producing copper alloy metal ornaments like this brooch here, not exactly this one, but items like it. And the interesting thing about those things, apart from the fact that we can look at them and realize that this was actually the location where some Viking Age ornaments were made, is that we can understand from the process that they relate to, that they were made in a, as has been known for a long while, in a serial process where multiple copies were made of the same models. And yeah, here's at least a reconstruction of the sequence as recreated by a Swedish archaeologist, Anders Söderberg. What's interesting about this is the fact that we get multiple impressions in these molds of the same model, whether, as in this case, it was perhaps an existing brooch, or it was a model which was produced for the case. It's not always as simple as that. Some complex ornaments must have been produced with several models. But again, this concept of copies and models and copies pervades this technology. And in this case, we excavated a workshop where exactly that was taking place from the early 9th century. My two colleagues here are sitting on the floor as we have separated them and examining various debris from it, including a rotating whetstone, and also looking at a little deposit of amulets which came up in that building. These amulets are very interesting indeed, partly because they seem to suggest a Christian ornament, a cross symbol, which has been, and partly for the fact that very similar pieces have been found in some other trading places, including Kaupang in Vestfold from the same period. So they seem to be a group of ornaments that have an affinity to the trading places, and one guess has been that they are connected to the missionary activities in those sites. But we had not just the objects there, but actually a mold for such a one, so perhaps our workshop here could have been producing some of these ornaments. What was interesting though was that we didn't just get these Christian ornaments which could fit in with our written sources that suggest a presence of missionaries at several stages, but we also found another group of what we think are amulets or amulet-like objects that has a completely different connotation. And what was interesting about these was also the fact that despite having worked or having had finds like that from Ribe from several locations since the 1970s, we had never found anything just like this deposit. It was clearly small pictorial objects, not the common, or what we think are common animal style ornaments from the Viking Age, but something showing figures, humans and naturalistic animals. In this case, we could clearly see a human figure there, but none of even when glued together, none of the fragments revealed a complete mold. So we started to think whether we could come around that problem by using 3D scanning and virtually realign the various fragments. So we initiated a collaboration with, well, we tried out our luck with several partners, but the people who turned out to have the best 3D scanner for the job was the Dental College in Aarhus. It's usually used to make teeth. Yeah, teeth replacements. And what turned out was that most other, of course, 3D print scanning has become a very regular thing, but most of the equipment that's around today does not have the precision. We could see how what we were getting were bad copies of the objects. But this one gave, at least at the visual level, a very faithful reproduction. And we were able, yeah, here you can actually see, we tried to compare various methods. Which one would you choose? Well, these two are actually both very good, but one is made with from what's called structure from motion, using a large number of photographies and calculating the 3D form shape from that. This is what the dentists could do, and this is a standard 3D scanner, which is clearly not up to the job. What's interesting though is that if we compare the precision here, that one is clearly warped from the original. So if you wanted really to compare in detail, we wouldn't use that one. And also, that one was created in a maximum of 5 minutes. This one took 4 hours and a very, very high-powered computer to calculate. So if we have 600 molds, I know which one I will start on. So we were able to complete and manage to get what we hope for, a virtually aligned image from the various molds, and it was interesting in several ways. One thing that I found was at a methodological level very interesting was that we had all in the team who had been looking at that, we had all agreed that this piece here was probably from a different but related model that was not identical to the other ones here. But once you tried to fit them together, it was very clear that it was just small mistakes in the copying. So we went from potentially having several models in use to having just one model used for everyone. And we got a very clear image of an object that doesn't exist, which I think is fascinating in some way. A find that's never been made, but it's out there somewhere in several copies. What does it show then? Well, we found out that we had to be very careful because the object is more enigmatic than you would think. It's showing, by the conventions of the Viking Age, a person dressed in a typical female dress with a long sleeve here, little feet coming out, with a sheath and a sword and a shield, and an object there that we first thought was a bead necklace, but having looked again, I think it's more likely that we are dealing with this object, a large button on bow brooch. And something up here that I recognize at least as a helmet with cheek pieces and some figure on top of it. So a very unusual kind of figure, and yet, as we will see, it is not by any means unique. It's just the best image that we have of that figure. All right, so we realized that this was worthwhile, and we have gone on recently to start. We got some funding from the Danish Augustinus Foundation to buy our own 3D scanner. The price is coming down, so it's still it's becoming more and more accessible to do this stuff. And we found the perfect person for the job, Derek Parrott, who is now a PhD student with us, is an American, but has studied in New York and is crazy with Viking Age jewelry. So he is now in the process of scanning the rest of our 600 mold finds and piecing them together and comparing them to stuff. And here's what our most recent raid on the National Museum in Denmark looked like. I think Bergen might be the only place in the world where you could gather a similar assemblage. And in the National Museum, none are stolen yet, so we started there. Derek has actually got 2 potential matches on his list that were among the pieces that are still missing from the Bergen collection. So we pray and hope that someday they'll be back. Anyway, I'll show you just a few examples of what kind of things we're currently working with. This is a rare type. We only know of 3 finds of this type of brooch, all from southern Jutland or the island of Fyn. But we have got about 10 molds. And here you can see how we can work out the object from the mold impression. And to our surprise, actually, when we thought we have such a small group, it's such a special find type, we have so few casting molds, this must be a one-off series. And yet we are sure by now that the model used for our molds is not identical to any of the three. So we get we get a surprise, and we see that we were actually thinking that we could, the scale of production was smaller than it turns out to be. Even a rare type like this had several original models. So we might be dealing with a much wider, much larger production than we have sometimes been inclined to believe. Here's another example. In this case, this was one we really struggled with even when we had proper light, but when we got the 3D scanner, the image was very clear and we could immediately recognize the one side of a sword pommel. And another nice and very unusual find. You don't tend to find large equal arm brooches like that in Danish finds, but apparently they were produced here, and because of the large amount of symmetry in Viking Age objects, you can allow yourself to play with what you've got and see what kind of objects we are dealing with, although not all the details are precise. But there's a lot of things you can do with scanning objects like that. So back to our example here. We were able to assemble not just the sword-bearing figure, but a number of others that came from the same workshop. There were all these very nice horse pictures that all fitted together to a horse-shaped pendant. There were two different but related figures of, by Viking Age conventions, a male figure with a prominent beard doing something with their heads and hand. And there were these little miniature objects: shield, sword, wheel, wagon wheel. And we published those about a year ago in a paper in the journal Medieval Archaeology, where we also tried to understand what could the potential meaning of that assemblage be. What's important about the assemblage is that individually some of these pieces can be paralleled by finds, actual finds, but all of these, or nearly all of them, are single finds. But in this case we have the ensemble from a single workshop, and therefore the suggestion that they must be functionally or related in the idea that they convey. At least we have we can raise that case. We can also see where that idea was present when we map out the parallels for the individual objects, as we've done here. And as you can see, by the present look of it, it's very much a Danish affair, and especially the sword-bearing figure has a quite distinct distribution from another dress-wearing amulet type here, those figures bearing a horn. That's very clearly the Swedish norm. We have a few examples here in Denmark as well, whereas the sword-bearing one turns up in Denmark, and interestingly, in a few cases in Eastern England, where of course the find picture is enhanced by a lot of metal detecting. We need more metal detecting up here, because I bet they are also here. So what are we dealing with? Well, some of the objects are pretty straightforward, at least in terms of what they are. These are miniature swords and miniature shields, and we've got similar objects. We also got similar ones to the wheel, but not so exact as here. The horse is more interesting. Horses were, of course, a symbol, an ancient symbol in Scandinavia, and we have got these examples of horse-shaped brooches that goes back to the Merovingian period by Norwegian terms. But what is different from these horses, which are pretty much in the Germanic animal style, from our horse is naturalism. All the details here they might be a little bit cartoon-like, but they're actually stylized naturalistic traits. We have an example here where you can also sort of appreciate the difference. And if at least what we became puzzled by was the strong similarity between the way that Carolingian, contemporary Carolingian images would depict a horse. And we started wondering, even with sort of detail. Of course, that might be just what a horse looks like in the 9th century, but still, I think the posture and the iconographic conventions could suggest that the person who did this horse was familiar with, to some extent, with something like those pictures. These pictures, again, are quite interesting in a European iconographic history because they relate to the Carolingian Renaissance, this new found desire to emulate classical antiquity. In that sense, this horse brooch from Viking Age Scandinavian sites is very interestingly related to the contemporary classical Renaissance in Western Europe. Something similar can actually be said for our image here. Archaeologists sometimes call this class of figures Valkyrie brooches. Parallels have been found, especially in Denmark, none of them exactly like our example, but again and again with the same combination of a female dress and a sword and a weapon, mostly a sword, but sometimes a shield. And also with a weird headdress. It's actually not as clear as it is in our case. I think in our case it's very clear that we're dealing with a helmet with cheek pieces. Some of the others are more weird or ambiguous, but I think something like that must also, once you see the similarity, be a helmet. And something weird is going on as well, because if we look closely, none of the pieces that where we can make it out are carrying the weapons in a proper fashion. We thought first that this figure is standing in a fighting position, but it's as if the artist has deliberately said, no, that's not how it is, because the sword is placed behind the shield. You would never do that if you were in a fighting position, to my knowledge. And look what's happening here. This person is carrying the shield with the arm on the outside holding the buckle, as if to say, don't be mistaken, this is not a person dressed for fight, this is something different. And you can hear, I think that person is even carrying the shield under the arm and a drinking horn. So something is going on. It's as if the image, tiny as it is, says, ceci n'est pas un pipe. This is not a fighter. But something equally interesting is where does this image then come from? And we can see on one side strong affinity with a Scandinavian tradition, especially these figures, female dress, horn carrying, female hairdo, which is an image we know from a number of sources, Merovingian period gold foil figures, so it's an old image, as an established, inherited image. It's also here in the some Gotlandic picture stones. So in one sense, the Valkyrie here, if we call it that, is a parallel or a development from that image, but it's got something else. Where does this weapon thing come from? And we started to notice that it's actually very similar to an image which was present in a special way in Viking Age trading places, namely in Roman coins, where we have this ubiquitous symbol of Victoria, the goddess, essentially Athena figure with sword, weapon, funny hat, and long dress. Our interpretation became, is this an iconographic innovation that's brought together from inherited Scandinavian images and new parallels, a new inspiration coming again from that Carolingian Renaissance, that rediscovery of classical antiquity. For our last image, we were not so sure. This person, which is clearly marked as male by the beard and also by these trousers, which we see in other images, could on one hand be compared to what has been called hair tearers, which are seen often as figures in ecstasy or rage. But we, perhaps especially I, started to think rather that although we could see some sort of contemporary parallel for that also in, this is a mermaid figure from a Carolingian manuscript showing that this idea of clutching hair is a gesture that is understood in contemporary art. I think we need to look in another direction, because while this image is unique, it's very closely related to a tradition which comes about around the same time of mask objects. You can see that they are masks because they emphasize the things that are particular to masks as opposed to just images of faces. The fact that you have an open mouth, yet you can breathe and speak through, and large open eyes that the actor can see through. And if this image, again with open mouth, bulging open eyes, if this is a mask, what is he doing? Well, I'm thinking, is he actually shown holding the mask? Is that why the hands has to be here as a gesture saying, don't be mistaken, this is not a person, this is a mask? If that's the case, then we can actually look twice at these again. Is this a human face, or is this a mask being held by a tiny figure? So all of these, again, remember, were found as an ensemble. They were all done in the same workshop in a similar style. So what is going on here? The normal interpretation, if you look in archaeological textbooks and papers, is that these are images of gods or religious symbols. These are called, often said to be Freya or Valkyrie figures in particular. But what if they are not? What if they are showing us something different? Why are they not? Is there another context that we can see these in? And we turned to various other image contexts. There are not so many, but we came upon, of course, you do before or sooner or later, the Oseberg tapestries. And the Oseberg tapestries, which are actually very closely contemporary with these figures from the 810s or 20 at the latest. What do they show? Well, they show lots of figures dressed in a dress that is conventionally very similar to our figures. They show what seems to be a procession. They show horses with wagons and wagon wheels, lots of weapons, sometimes floating freely about. And the context of this group has mostly been reconstructed as a religious cult drama, possibly related to the drama that was actually taking place at a funeral like the Oseberg funeral, or simply to the annual sacrifice feasts. If this is the context, if this is our image parallels, then we could reconstruct this group of objects as something that alludes to the same kind of events as the Oseberg tapestry does in its way, something that is worn perhaps on specific occasions to allude to the large dramas of the cult, perhaps since these are not very, would not have been very exclusive ornaments, perhaps in contexts where those cult dramas were not themselves performed to the same extent. In fact, our two figures there together resembles very closely a complex group that we didn't find, but which has been obviously at some point became quite a standard figure. Lots of examples have been found of this. What does that show? Usually it has been interpreted as an adventus scene where a warrior is received in Valhalla by proxy of his horse. And there's been a lot of debate about what exactly we're seeing. But if we look at our images, we see a horse, we see a person with a weapon and a funny hat and shield, dress, horse, weapons. This piece here on several of the images is very clearly a knife, and the figure here always holds a horn. So we get a combination in this of all the elements, or nearly all the elements that we see individually in our very early, perhaps prototypes for it. Neil Price, professor in Uppsala, has written in a paper some years back that perhaps what we're seeing in some of the images from the Viking Age are not gods and heroes, but ordinary people in extraordinary situations. And that's the situation I would like to endorse with this, that we are not actually seeing sacred beings, but we're seeing what Viking Age people saw. And if you look through the history of iconography, religious iconography, that's very often what you will find. Because, as one historian of religion that I discussed it with said, very few people have seen the gods, but everybody has seen the rituals. And that's why the rituals become the common visual language of the holy. And I think that that's what could be explained, what we're seeing here. And to me, could explain also why they are even more interesting than we've seen before, because if that's true, then we have actual depictions of things that went on in ritual situations in the early Viking Age. So in Denmark, we have a very flamboyant designer and artist, Jim Lyngvild, who has been the enfant terrible of the museum scene in recent years, and he learned about these reconstructions, and he sent me this picture. Just went out and took it because he can, and he said, "Is that what you mean?" And of course he had to do a little tweak, so he takes the gender ambiguity and turns it around once more. Here's a man wearing a female dress, but this could also be. But I complained to him and said, well, yeah, you get the idea, but Jim, the horse. So he said, all right, I'll grant you the horse, and he did another one. So, and with this, I actually think that he comes close to what I think we're seeing. We're seeing a sacrificial scene. Somebody who was a vet told me that you don't have to actually kill the horse. You can cut a vein and let out the blood, and perhaps that's actually I would be ready to buy that. But I think that's what they're showing us. I think that's what we are being allowed to see by reconstructing these fragments of unfound brooches from a workshop floor in Ribe. And how does that relate? Well, again, people who have grown up in a Christian tradition, we are very often thinking about the holy as something that's very austere, related to specialized and a very, very highly organized religion. But what was folk religion like in ancient Europe? Well, think again about the Dionysia and Anthesteria bacchanals and carnivals of the medieval and ancient past. I think that we're seeing a Nordic reflection of that, and that this is where we should start thinking about the relation between the kind of images that we have preserved from the Viking Age and what was going on. And with that, I'll end the talk. So thank you for your patience.
So thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I'm pretty sure that there is many questions. So yeah, you can keep that because they will, yeah.
Perhaps we need questions for...
To send it around, yeah. Okay, yeah, we can do that. So, we take you first, Søren.
All right, I'll be the first. This was a very fascinating lecture, and there's so much in it that I'm really inspired of it. And one thing I liked very much is that your interpretations of the iconography here, it's not new that we put interpretation into these things. And if you, for example, take the Valkyries, they have been debated a lot. And normally the interpretations start from what is acceptable today in the social politics of today. So, of course, the Uppsala environment will interpret these as female warriors because that's very much into politics today. And I do not exclude at all the thought about female warriors. It actually makes a lot of sense. But I think that the way you work with it and say that, all right, this iconography actually has a context of its own in its contemporary time and looking to the European material, I think that makes a lot of sense. At least it challenges a lot of the freestanding interpretations of today. But have you had any reactions on your interpretations yet? And another small thing is that the masks, is that what Flemming Cowell has been talking about with the trolle figures?
It may or may not. So to take the masks first, when we published the paper a year ago, our interpretation was actually going in that direction. And it was only later when we looked again that I became convinced that masks is a more likely one. So the interpretation is actually not really out there, but yeah. I think Flemming, we've discussed it with Flemming, so he could easily have also taken it up. I'm starting to see a lot of masks, and I'm being a little bit cautious about it. But I think that it's with these examples and with this tradition that our image could be seen to be an early example of. It's a likely suggestion. The warrior there, the female warrior or Valkyrie or what, we have actually not, it's not generated the outcry that we could have feared. I was fearing in the current climate that we would be seen as being hitting back at the idea, which we are actually not. I completely accept the idea of the female warrior, and I think also when we start to look at the parallels and context for that in world history, it's present in a lot of places, and we just haven't, again, from our former social context, have just not accepted it. But this is not a female warrior. You couldn't survive 5 minutes in the battlefield in this dress, and they're so specific with the details that it must be meaningful. This is not a Viking Age helmet. It reminds me actually of Beowulf, where there's a lot of this rhetoric about the ancient objects. And if you look at how keen they were to preserve hall buildings, for instance, for several hundred years, I'm very sure that they kept Merovingian period objects for particular use. Senator Glørstad and what's his name recently wrote this wonderful paper about the survival of button and bow brooches in the Viking Age, which is one place where you can actually see these being curated. Other brooches go with the person and go to the grave with the person, but these are being curated because they're part of the sacred or family inheritance object, and I think that everything that figure is wearing is part of that, and is part of how would you mark out a situation, a ritual situation in a wealthy farm in the Viking Age as something special? You would dress up. You would dress up in weird things, cross-dressing, out of time dressing, and I think that's, if you look at the images together, that's what it's showing. And I can say that Leszek Gardela, who's another researcher who's looked into this, has more or less bought into the idea and adjusted his interpretation. So I think he's in agreement with us. But of course, to the Danish metal detectorists, Valkyries will be Valkyries.
Simon had another question.
Thank you again for, of course, for the presentation. And of course, since you ended on the note of, what kind of Mediterranean or classical forebears do we might we have here? So of course, I have some ideas. As a classical archaeologist, and perhaps Eivind and Jørgen can support me or oppose me, but I think that you might find quite a lot of interesting material. Of course, it's always hard to use analogies, but you might find a lot of inspiration by looking at Roman funerary rites. For instance, the image that you showed about these persons that held their hands high, with an open mouth, and often we can find these in Roman art. We call them oranter, and they are often interpreted as praying. But even more fascinating, I think, those figures, of course, with not only holding their hands high, but actually tugging at the hair, is we can also see those in Roman art, of course, and they also interpreted as criers, professional criers. So always part of the funeral procession, and it's important to have females crying during the rites, and also for the men to cry. That's also an important part in Roman culture, at least. And then finally, the female with the weapons can, of course, be interpreted in several different ways, I think. But if you look at Republican Roman funerary rites, of course, they had, as part of the rite, that the deceased person would have been represented by a person in the funeral procession. So not only as part of the dead body, but also with a mask present in the funerary procession himself, and also his weapons being present in the funeral procession. So I think there's a lot of things to unpack and be inspired from Roman practice, of course, which we know quite a lot about from texts. Yeah, so that's just my comment.
I'm very keen to continue those conversations, and I think that we probably just scratched the surface of something here. There's one thing that, as you said, with the mask there, I'm also wondering to what extent, we always call these helmets, but they're helmets that very clearly cover the face. To what extent are they actually masks? Were they ever thought of as equipment for battle, like the great Vendel helmet? Well, they could be, but are they not more properly things that masks a person in a ritual context.
We actually even have a sort of a hybrid there in the Roman material, because we often have sort of ceremonial helmets that also are masks.
Yeah.
So there's a hybrid there. There can be both helmet and mask at the same time.
Thank you.
Søren has another comment.
Yes, the figures with people with raised hands, would that be the same as you have on the Vendel period figures of Berserker or Ulfhednir? You know, the Swedish ones going in a procession. Would that be the same? And then next, another question. There has been some debate from Swedish archaeologists talking about that the definition of town is fluid in Denmark for the time being, and well, maybe Ribe is not so much in dispute, but a lot of the other towns where we apparently Danish archaeologists say that we have a town, and Swedish archaeologists seems to say, oh, hold back a little. What do you think about that discussion?
Yes. I think we probably won't never completely lose that discussion. It's been going on since the 1970s, where I can point to the dozens of papers that start with, well, towns are difficult to define. It's not just a Danish-Swedish divide, because the most sort of provocative statement in recent years have been that the Iron Age center Ubågren Lund was an urban community. And all here is, of course, about understandings and definitions. If you're thinking about if by town you mean a settlement that is different from a typical rural settlement and connects different networks, then perhaps there's something to it. But on the other hand, internationally, very few archaeologists are happy to talk about towns, cities that are only 10, 20 hectares large. So I think we have a very wild-growing debate that perhaps has more to do with the prestige of the concept of urbanism. And that's certainly the case in the Danish archaeology, where, as I see, a lot of the present debate goes back to the 1980s neo-evolutionism that was expressed in the project From Tribe to State, fra stamme til stat, that still has an extraordinary afterlife, and especially in the Danish museum community, where it's still being taken for granted that the fundamental narrative of the Iron Age and the Viking Age is one of a gradually rising social complexity towards state. I think if you look a little bit circumspect about the situation today, that's not how most archaeologists internationally see it today. We recently had the great debate about the Grabner Wengro's monograph, The Dawn of Everything, where they fiercely oppose this evolutionary perspective. But I think I can say for sure that that's not a debate that has hit the wider archaeological community in Denmark very hard as yet. But I think that we perhaps we can allow ourselves to talk about towns. It is a vague concept by any means, but when I feel fairly okay with calling Ribe a town, it's because I think that in its functions, in its economic functions, it was so similar to what we'd call an urban economy in terms of housing people who relied on secondary and tertiary occupations and were not self-producers, and only that. I think that there's a particular reason for that, which is not what is in our common models. Ribe is not to me a case of gradually evolving social complexity, but perhaps more to do with how strangers were handled legally in a pre-modern concept. That's why we have these activities so spatially restricted to particular areas. In some sense, it's probably a place where there was special jurisdiction, and that's why they are living so ridiculously concentrated. They're living in a big open air landscape, and yet their buildings are set closely one gable to the next. Only legal provisions could make such madness. I hope that went some way to an answer.
Okay, we can take a couple of questions more if somebody wants to ask. Otherwise, I think there is one in the chat. Yeah. There is Ivar Jordre is asking in the YouTube chat how does Ribe stand out compared to the Norwegian Emporia? What Emporia? Norwegian. Yeah. And what are the characteristics?
Well, the main thing, the key difference, I think, is the very simple one that Ribe emerges around 700 AD, which is 100 years before Kaupang and 250 years at least before Trondheim, for instance. So something is going on at another period of time. That being said, I think we can see some very interesting similarities in the kind of organization in these places, both the sort of physical organization, which was traced by the excavations in Kaupang 20 years ago, and I think actually even more convincingly demonstrated by the great excavations in Trondheim, which is a site from around year 1000 in the early levels, but where we have this special urban type landscape of houses set closely one next to the other, and with virtually every building showing a strong concentration of specialized activities, craftworking in particular. So I think that the short answer is that Ribe is a precursor or an early example of something transferring, a model of settlement transferring into a new territory, and something that's been so successful that it's been copied. I don't think Ribe is the first example of this, but it may be actually early in a very in a new line of transformations. In the period around 700, when Ribe emerged, of course there were already trading settlements in the Netherlands and in England. The ones in England were only a generation old by that time, and they very characteristically come about in the time when there is very strong connections between the Anglo-Saxon, English, and Rome. These are developed in the second half of the 7th century. And we know, for instance, that there were bishops. The Archbishop of Canterbury at this time was born and raised in a late Roman context in the early 600s in Eastern Mediterranean. So there was clearly a lot of Roman knowledge present about how to organize an exchange system, and we can see that coming into that kind of knowledge coming into the English organization of the English Church. We can see it coming into organization of economy in terms of the shatter coinage, which emerged at the same time. Why wouldn't we expect it to come into the organization of trading places? And if it did, then I think early Rome, early London, for instance, is a beautiful illustration of what that would look like. Ribe comes about a generation later, and I think that that is again a transformation of that new system which has been negotiated between the Anglo-Saxons, their new Roman friends, and the North Sea coastal population who are involved in this. So in that sense, I think that places like Kaupang and later Kaupang and Nidaros, Trondheim, were branches on the same scheme or developing model of place.
Okay. We take the last question with Jørgen.
Well, as usual, I say it's more of a comment than a question, because a little bit of a critical comment, perhaps, because I think, I mean, your sort of idea about the theatrical masks and costumes, I buy that, and I think that's very, very interesting. But I'm a little bit skeptical to your using parallels from sort of pre-Christian, ancient Greek and Roman processional and theatrical culture, because it's not really, it doesn't really remind a lot about that, I think. But we are, after all, talking about 10th century Europe here, even though it's not 10th century Christian Europe. But I mean, Carnival, for instance, is a popular Christian festival before Lent, and I think that you will find both in Western Christian sort of popular festivals, theaters, mystery plays, both in Western and Eastern Europe, you will find actually some interesting parallels to this material. So it's just an idea.
Yeah. And I think that's a very likely idea. The problem that I think we're coming up against is that there are very few depictions of that. We know, for instance, Bonifacius writes fumingly about how all the pagan things that are going on even in Rome. There is a long and strong tradition into early modern times and perhaps beyond from that kind of folk religion. But in the Christian period, at least to my knowledge, in the 9th and 10th century, we don't really have depictions of that. The monks in the scriptoria were not too keen to illustrate that kind. So with something like the weapon-bearing figure here, I find it difficult not to think that there is a direct relation with the image translated by the coins. Perhaps it was also an idea that was then translated into folk festivals elsewhere, but I think there is a link. I think we're missing a lot of links, and many of those could definitely be in the mystery plays and all that undercurrent of religion, which was certainly there, but which we know so little of, to my knowledge at least. Yeah.
Okay, I think this is a very good way to close the session today, leaving us with a question, or one, more than one. I would like to thank you, Søren, one more time for being here today, and thank you all of you who have come today here to the room, and those in the live stream. Thank you for following us. And yeah, let's continue this over a drink, maybe.
Thank you.